Firstly, thank you, Sean, for inviting us. It's a
Mm,
privilege to be here today, and we're excited to be here. And hopefully, people will learn something. I hope it's an interactive discussion. We don't want to just be talking for 45 minutes. We want people to ask questions. We also have a lot to learn. For now, I'll start with a small introduction. There's our agenda. So my name is Rob Bedford. I am one of the co-founders of Franklin Health. We're a contract research organization specializing in medical technology and diagnostics clinical research. I lead up the clinical operations department. My expertise is pretty much clinical operations. I started my career as a neuroscientist working on treatments for inherited forms of blindness, and then almost by accident found myself in the medical device industry. I started my career at the very bottom, so the most exciting part in some respects is as a study coordinator. I worked with the patients and the doctors to recruit patients into clinical trials, and then since then I've worked in industry, leading programs of clinical research for very large manufacturers such as J&J, Stryker, Smith and Nephew, QIAGEN. So my entire career has been focused on leading clinical research projects for large manufacturers. And so my counterpart, Laura, I met when we were on opposite sides of the sponsor CRO table. She brings to Franklin Health the CRO expertise. So I'll just pause there and let Laura introduce herself.
thank you, Rob. Yeah, so my name is Laura. I kind of started my career in something totally different. I started as a physiotherapist, pediatric physiotherapist. So the first 5 years of my career, I worked as a physiotherapist, gained a lot of experience also really on the floor, if I can say it that way, but then also found out quite quickly that the actual practical work of being a physiotherapist wasn't exactly what I was looking for, which I didn't realize during university because we did have this very scientific approach at that time. So then I kind of found my way into clinical research, and I started off right away where I am still right now with medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. So I started my career really as a regulatory specialist and also safety specialist in a very small CRO that was in the end acquired by a bigger fish. So I was acquired with that and spent some time at a bigger CRO that was IQVIA at that time. And then I moved to Icon. I always stayed within study startup. So that is really what is my passion. Um, I am fully focused, as I said, on medical devices and IVD. So this is really specifically within the EU, a very interesting landscape. So I'm quite happy, actually, Sean, that you invited us, that we have the opportunity to talk specific about study startup, because in many ways, it's kind of the important or one of the most important phases of the study. If things already derail during study startup, that's just not a great start for your study. So yeah, happy to be talking with all of you about this. Again, we have quite some slides, but just feel free to interrupt us at any time if there's any experience you want to share, any questions that you have. We're so happy to just have a discussion. Yeah, and I hope it will be interesting and helpful for you all. So if you can go
Thank you,
to
Laura.
the
Sure.
next slide, Rob.
So yeah, I'll only be brief on this because really what I want the purpose of this webinar is for people to learn and for us to communicate some of our experience and also to have the opportunity to learn from others as well. So it's not a sales call or anything. We are a medtech focused CRO. We don't do pharma or biotech, and we provide end-to-end regulatory and clinical services for both device and diagnostics companies worldwide. We're based in the UK. We have an office in Denmark, and we also have one office in Spain. And one of the unique things about Franklin Health is that we only work with small and mid-sized medtech manufacturers. So there's no giants that are going to come along, offer a large project, and then we're going to move the team over. We only work with the small to mid-sized manufacturers. And our mission is just to help the innovators generate the clinical evidence they need to launch, grow, and stay ahead. So that's a little bit about us. Okay, so the scope of this webinar is delays during study startup. So we have a little timeline here that Laura is going to go through with you to think about some of the times when delays can appear during study startup, and then in the following slides we're going to figure out if we can maybe reduce the scope of those delays, and we have some solutions and suggestions.
Yeah. In the meantime, Rob, I see a question in the chat. If we work with startup software as medical device um, studies as well, do you want to take that?
Of course, yes. To answer your question, yes, we do. We're currently working with a software as a medical device client at the moment to support their study design. We are in close communication with Scarlett. They're the notified body for software as a medical device. So we have an open communication platform with them. So we can support with study design, clinical trial execution, and then liaising with the notified body. So yes, we do have some recent experience with this.
Mm.
But good
Yeah, so
question.
and very relevant, huh?
Yeah.
So, what I wanted to talk you guys through with this slide is how important it is to have an efficient study startup phase. Put some numbers in there, not to shock you, but just to make sure that we all know what we're actually talking about. So, study startup phase can take a very, very long time. Starting with, of course, the design of the study, which is typically 2 4 months, then it actually can be quite different. For site selection, obviously, depending on the number of sites, it can take 1 month if you only have a few sites, but it can also take 6 months if you have many sites, if it's difficult to actually select because you have a specific indication, specific requirements. So you can already see that as from the moment of site selection, things can already take quite a long time. And then we have regulatory submissions, so ethics submissions, competent authority submissions, IRB submissions in the US, but also contracting and also these kind of timelines, you will see it's a wide range. No, it can be 2 months, but it can also be up till 7 months. Contracting can be up till 12 months, and you'll be like, wow, that's too much. And it definitely is. And that's why we actually have this webinar, because we just want to walk you through the experience that we have in actually being able to reduce those timelines and be able to start up your study efficiently, pull that all a little bit together. I think, Rob, if you click one more, we also have patient recruitment, of course, which is part of study startup, but of course also when the study is ongoing. If you can go to the next slide, Rob, I think we will just go ahead with the first one that we want to tackle, which is study design.
Yes. So when thinking about a study design, so manufacturers of devices and diagnostics, they will have three things in mind. They'll want to design a study that one is going to be good for the regulators. So when you're thinking about a clinical trial design, you have to satisfy the regulatory frameworks and the pathways from which you're getting your device to market. So you're going to be thinking about your endpoints, your objectives. Do they meet the regulatory requirements? Will the study design allow me to perform the analyses? Am I going to have a sufficient patient population? Is it statistically powered? And also fundamentally, and this is what the notified bodies and FDA look at, does your study demonstrate performance, safety, and clinical benefits, depending on the class risk profile? So when you're thinking about your study design, you have to have in mind what the regulators consider as best practice. And one of the ways that you can give yourself the best chance for success is looking perhaps at what your competitors do, what's on the literature, how do you demonstrate clinical benefit of device X, and then you can work backwards and design a trial design that allows you to fulfill those objectives. When you're also thinking about study design, you also have to be mindful of the clinical sites, because not only do you have to satisfy the regulators, you have to design a clinical protocol that is going to work in real life. So you think about the hospitals, the doctors, the surgeons, these are the ones who are going to implement your protocol into practice. And so you have to be mindful of how this is going to work in real life. So some important questions. You want to know if the data that you want to capture is that available during clinical practice? Are the doctors, nurses, surgeons, study coordinators, are they going to have to go out of their way to collect this? How much data do I need to collect to support your endpoint analysis? Is the visit schedule reasonable for both the patient and the site? Is the volume of data to be collected reasonable? Are you asking 10,000 questionnaires, collecting so much data, and in the end, the regulators only care about 10% of it? Um, are there any red flags for an ethics committee? Are you going to have 15 PET scans in a week? I know that's an exaggeration, but you need to be thinking about possible delays. And so this is the most important one for the purpose of this webinar is delays from the clinical site perspective. And then also finally, are there any complex activities? Is there anything that you're wanting to do in your clinical trial which deviates from the norm in such a way that you're going to have issues with the hospital, with ethics committees? And then the final one, this is not necessarily relevant for the for this webinar, which is delays to study startup, but it's something that all manufacturers will be thinking about. Is my device solving a problem for hospitals, for doctors? Will my device provide clinical benefits? Does it provide economic benefit? Does it bring costs down? And also, when I ultimately bring my device to market, is the cost of it going to be in line with hospital budgets? And is that commensurate with improvements in outcomes? So these are the three factors that you need to consider when building your study design. So the one I'll focus on briefly today is the clinical sites. So this is how this is the best way to think about it if you're thinking about hospitals and where your study is actually going to be run. So you can have the best protocol on paper, and I've seen this many, many times. You have 1,000 word protocol written by geniuses. It's fantastic, but in real life, it doesn't work because this study needs to be delivered by human beings who have schedules, they have patients, and probably 90% of their time is spent not on research. So these are busy doctors, busy nurses. So you need to make sure that your protocol is not only great on paper, but is workable in real life. I can think of an example for a robotics study that I led a couple of years ago. The sponsor wanted to collect lots and lots of real-time data about this robotics, this surgical robot, and that meant the patient was going to have to be undergo anesthesia for a little bit longer. So they got to the very end of the process, and the clinician said, "Well, no, we're not going to do that because the number one factor is patient safety." And then they had to go and revise the protocol. So how can you fix that? My advice would be to engage clinicians and site staff in the development of the protocol as early as possible. So when you're drafting the protocol, book a call with someone who's going to actually utilize this protocol in real life, and then also the ECRFs as well. If you have ECRFs that are perhaps not standard questionnaires, they're more bespoke questionnaires, go through these with the site as well. Make sure that your protocol is going to be workable in real life. The second delay that I often see is where you have activities that deviate a lot from standard clinical practice. What you really want to do is to try and keep your clinical trial as close to standard practice as possible so that the data collection becomes an extra piece of work rather than a huge activity that they need to undertake with lots of training. An example I have is I worked on a dementia study several years ago, and the sponsor wanted to collect some neurophysiology measurements, which involved lots of weird and wonderful equipment and lots of specialists. And they spent ages and ages and ages on the site setup activities trying to find neurophysiologists at each hospital to collect this one questionnaire that didn't even end up being submitted to the regulator anyway. So be pragmatic, be simple, try and reduce the amount of data that you can collect that satisfies those three considerations I mentioned on the previous slide. And again, engage clinicians and site staff in the development to see if there are any of these potential delays. And then the final one is, are you going to cause any safety risks or excessive strain to your patients? Are you asking for 5 lumbar punctures when you can only use 2? So think about what an ethics committee will think. Think about the human realities of your study. And because these often can lead to delays and pushback from the ethics committee revisions of the protocol. So for me, these are top 3 delays. Sean, I'll just pause there for a moment in case anyone has any questions.
Yeah, I think it would be a good time to ask the audience if they have any actual experience with any of these, study delays or engaging with the clinicians, or, where the rubber meets the road, I think is a really good framing for this. Is like, yeah, it looks good on paper, and then, you put it in the hands of human beings, and it goes sideways the second you do that. Our best thinking only gets us so far, and then reality strikes. So, has
hmm
anybody had any experiences with this that they want to chime in on that's online? I don't know.
I'm happy to chime in.
Hi, Arlen.
Hi. Um, so I run the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs. And these are a bunch of folks that are trying to get ideas to patients and engage pretty much everyone on this audience. And just to lend the experience that it's a two-way street in terms of how clinicians work with non-clinicians that they need to help them get an idea to a patient like you folks, and vice versa. How do you engage clinicians at the early startup stage? And when I say clinicians, I mean pharmacists, nurses, dentists, any health profession. Now, I'm based in the United States, and I totally understand there's a different culture in other places, but fundamentally the problem is the same, which is how do we connect the dots, and how do we do it in an efficient way that is cost effective for people that really don't have a fundamental understanding, particularly in medical device, software as a medical device, et cetera, and all the AI risks that are associated with it. So, so I'm interested in your ideas as to how do we close the data doctor gap, so that, because we're always saying you need clinicians early in the product development phase, but when it comes to execution, actually making that happen, there's significant barriers. So I'm interested in, how do we do that? How do we close the gaps?
Yeah, good question, Arlen. And I acknowledge those challenges. I'm assuming you're meaning financial challenges. If you want to engage a clinician early on, they often will expect payment and they are quite expensive. Um, and then also the patient side as well, they're perhaps less expensive. And I know you mentioned that you were in the US, we're in the UK. One of the requirements for UK submissions in for clinical research is that you need to demonstrate that you have involved patients in the design of the clinical study. So you need patient and end user involvement. Um, so typically sponsors do have key opinion leaders or experts that they work with. And what I would recommend to our sponsors is that they engage those as part of the design process, just to make sure that, as we've described here, that a protocol is workable in practice. However, if you're a smaller organization, you may not have 10 different key opinion leaders on your email contact list. So then perhaps organizations such as yours, Arlen, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what your organization does and how you could possibly help.
Sure. We're an international, so the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs is something that's been around for now 14 years. We launched it as a nonprofit. So we're an international nonprofit, open biomedical and clinical innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem. In other words, anybody can join, which is why I'm on this call, because I want you folks to be in the game. And not that you're not, but this issue of, well, how do we help people find you? I mean, it seems to me that's a straightforward dating service platform. Here's what you do, here's how your expertise, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, and then folks in our network can go to that site, put in a search term, I need medical device regulatory affairs or AI, whatever, and then put up a list of folks and how to contact you and your information.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree with you. However, I have to point out to you that you're talking about a two-sided marketplace, which is there's nothing deadlier in marketing than a two-sided marketplace. And that there have been plenty of people that have tried and failed, much better people than I. And so what I think the point is that it's you're marketing to two completely separate audiences, and you're trying to build a platform. So in terms of the technology, yes, the technology is very simple, but the marketing challenge is very complex. I don't want to go down that road too far, but other than to say we are trying to create an ecosystem that supports all players in the field, and then to say, let's engage on this offline because I don't want to get off track too far from today's call, which is really about um, study startup. So, not to cut you off, Arlen, because I appreciate your contribution, but that's moving down a branch that we don't have time to get into today. That's all.
Well, that's fair. I'm happy to talk about this offline. If you, I'll put the link on the thing, and I'm happy to
Yeah,
talk about this offline.
me too.
Great, thank you. But it's a great point, Alan, and I think patients should be involved in study startups. And I think if they are involved, then that will reduce delays. So yeah, we're happy to. I'd love to chat to you more after the call. So thank you for that. Okay, we'll now move on to some of the delays caused by site feasibility and selection.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. So yeah, for site feasibility and selection, as you know, as you can imagine, there is so much variability in between how sites perform and how responsive they are. So that's something that we are dealing with on a daily basis. Now, when thinking about some ways to overcome that, there are quite some things that we can do, luckily. So, for example, if and that may be a bit obvious, if there are some existing site relationships that you already have as a sponsor or that your CRO has, then that is one of the key factors to leverage. Because if you know that sites have been high performing before, if they have been activated before, that is already a great indication that that relationship can go well, and people already know exactly how they need to collaborate. Besides that, because I acknowledge not everyone has a huge site network that they can leverage, there's some other things, of course, that we can do. And one of those is to make sure that from our side, the feasibility process runs as structured as possible. Really to slim it down to what are the actual key factors that you want to know and include only the decision critical items. Make sure that your questions are also not ambiguous. Know that it's quite clear what the answer is that you would like to get out of that feasibility questionnaire. And also if sites are already unresponsive at an early stage, that is an indication for how it will be going further down in your study. So take that into account as well. Some very important things to ask early on are local approval requirements, because, in countries, it could be that you have on national level, you need to get competent authority approval, you need to get ethics approval, but then you get into the weeds of it. And some sites also need their own local approvals. And those can sometimes even be longer to obtain than the actual competent authority and ethics committee approval. So it happens often that you get to a point that a site is already selected, and only then you find out that there is an additional approval that derails your home timelines, which is why it's so critical to include that into your whole feasibility process. Same thing with contract negotiation timelines, or if there are any kind of templates that the site needs to stick to. Really make sure that you have that information straight and that you can make decisions based on that. Of course, all sites, and Rob and I were talking about it earlier, all sites will be telling you that they have the greatest recruitment potential, that contract timelines are basically from today till tomorrow. So it's really also important to look a little bit beyond that, and to make sure that you request some objective evidence of that amazing recruitment potential, but also that you actually get to know your site. So if you have the possibility to go to the site, to actually talk through things with them, to make sure that they really understand the study, what is required, what is needed in terms of training and facilities, that is really key to make sure that you actually can go smoothly and select the right sites. Also, could be kind of an idea to select a whole, or at least to run feasibility on a whole bunch of sites, which will only increase administrative burden for the sites and also for yourself. So make sure that you are going to reach out to just the right number of sites. Another thing you can do from your own side is to make sure that you reduce the bureaucratic decision layers. Fancy way of saying, like, make sure that if there are any decisions that your CRO can make for you, for example, a CRA can ad hoc already see like this is not going to work, make sure that they also have that decision power so that not every decision needs to go up to the sponsor, because all these kind of different layers of communication lead to delays as well. And value proposition, of course, and make sure that the site really understands what the relevance is for being in the study. Scientific relevance, for example, access to novel devices can also be financially. You need to be very transparent on what it actually means for them. So all these kind of things are really important to take into account. So how do you do that practically? On the next slide, we just have a few questions that that can help you.
Yes.
So
So one of
you
our
want to?
Yeah, sure, Laura. Yeah, one of the things that we have to do, one of our challenges when we're running through site feasibility, is to cut through the noise. Because when we're prospecting sites, trying to find out which are the best sites, they typically a site will tell you, yes, of course I can deliver this study. I have access to 1 million patients. We've done many studies like this before. We have the best equipment, because they all want to win the project. They all want to be paid the large sums of money that you receive for running a site. So you have to read between the lines, and you have to be able to ask the more difficult questions. So these top 7 questions are very basic questions, which will form the part of every feasibility questionnaire. So we want to know, have you delivered a study like this before? Do you have access to the right patients and sufficient numbers of patients? Do you have the right equipment, the right facilities? Do you have the right experience? Do you have dedicated study coordinators? Are you running any competing studies? Because often the very biggest sites have got 6 orthopedic studies, and you're then competing for the same group of patients. Do you have time to deliver the study? And also, fundamentally, what are your local approvals timelines? Because if you have lots of weird and wonderful local approvals process, this can really derail your first patient in. So how do you cut through that noise? Visit the site. You should be doing this as part of site qualification. Don't just rely on the questionnaires on their own. Ask for specific examples when referring to the questions. Run through the protocol synopsis. This is the most important one for me when I'm doing a site qualification and feasibility. Have a brief run through of the protocol, talk about the endpoints, the objectives, the patient population, the eligibility criteria. You'll find the very best performing sites will have, that's meant to say, lots of questions. They'll have lots of feedback. They'll say, not sure about this part of the protocol. What about this part? They're the very best and most engaged and most proactive sites. So it becomes clear the people that just say yes to everything, and the ones that are actually going to deliver your study on time, and they're going to be your best performers. So yeah, good, thorough feasibility can save huge delays in the long run.
This is Dan. Just wanted, along what you're discussing here, I think that those are great questions, but obviously I think you pinpointed quite correctly that some of these questions, they will definitely say yes, even if they don't have it. But obviously, I think that when it comes to clinical studies, it's all about also documentation generation. And that documentation has to be reliable, has to be trustworthy. So whatever means of data and documentation generation capabilities they have, whether it's electronic and or paper, it is to me important to sort of keep track of that. The experience with applicable regulations, a lot of these clinical site studies, they may not have really experience of understanding exactly what it means to do the clinical study. And to me, the third one is what's the workload they have? Because if they are a site that are just willing to take studies, your workload may be so overwhelming that they may just have one clinical study competing against another, and then in the end they're going to give you average work. Just thoughts from my side.
My experience too is depending where it is, the paperwork is overwhelming for a lot of them. When they go in and see the actual what it takes to run a study, and they are overwhelmed with the amount of paperwork, and they think it's ridiculous. They're like, "Are you serious? We have to fill out all this paperwork?" So having somebody go in there and hold their hands is key.
To your point, Carrie, data integrity is as vital when you're running a clinical study as it is when you're running a commercial production operation. So
Exactly. You have to have the clinical trial folders and have
absolutely.
somebody keep, you know, and you have to have the surgeons, make sure they're filling out the paperwork, because a lot of times you go in there, the doctors don't want to fill that out for you. They think it's ridiculous. And so you have to have somebody holding their hands as well as what the assistants, and informed consents are very important.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
It is, yes. And I've worked with many sites who are small. Perhaps it's one of their first ever clinical studies, and it can go one of two ways. So often the sites that have not worked with clinical trials before, they're so engaged, they want to do everything right. They think, oh, I need to get this right. But also they can be completely overwhelmed and think, oh my goodness, all this paperwork, I'm drowning in paperwork, and it's new to them. The idea of GCP, the idea of an investigator site file, a regulatory binder is new to them, and they think. And so with newer sites, I would say setting the expectations early is really important, because when you go to Duke University or Stanford, they've got thousands of research coordinators who've done this many, many times. You don't need to train them. But if you go to a small family clinical practice, they may actually deliver the study fantastically, but they'll probably need more of a learning curve. They'll probably need more guidance
The
as you go
hand
along. So
holding.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And I would always
With a
recommend a
smile.
good with a smile, yeah.
Yeah.
With exactly, and they can sometimes be fantastic. And I would always recommend to sponsors having a mix of large sites and small sites. So if you have all Dukes, you'll never get your study started because the contracting will just take years and years.
Mhm.
But if you have really small sites, there's some risk there. So yeah, fantastic points. Thank you, Daniel and Carrie. Appreciate that. I can see, Andrea, you have your hand up.
Yeah. And so with the feasibility questionnaire, so I can recommend get in contact with the sites. I had a lot of studies where we sent out the feasibility questionnaire, and later on we had difficulties because they mentioned numbers they could not even get into the studies. They did not really read, they just wanted to participate. So this is something, get in contact, really ask if they have all this patients available, if they really think they can get these patients in. So this is very important. And then also usually the feasibility, and later on you send them a synopsis or the protocol after you have a CDA, and then you need to make sure that they really understand. For example, if there is for a comparison, so controlled study with standard practice, usually standard practice, but to have it comparable to the new or device under investigation, they need to have a different practice, or maybe they are not allowed to use a special disinfectant or something like this. It needs to be clear. So this is sometimes you can get into trouble when they already start, they agreed to everything, and after that they start complaining that it is not per standard routine. So and then they don't want to do it, and you cannot involve these patients then anymore. You need to exclude those because they just do not want to cope with the protocol, right? So this is something, a feasibility questionnaire is sent quickly.
Yep.
But and they complete it quickly, but it's really needs always a little bit more time. And if it is a small new CRO like yours, I think what you can always do is let the people know, the sponsors know, that you have more time for smaller projects, that you can, or so, that you can work more hand in hand with the site, get direct. So it depends on what you want to, what studies you want to do, you know. But so, and if you go to other countries as well, so just collaborate with other small CROs in that country or overseas or something. So this is something that's very good. But
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, she
Yeah.
brings up an interesting point about working with small CROs, and I've heard this a lot. And one point that I would like to drive home is that when companies go to work with the larger CROs, they're often deprioritized. So particularly for small to medium size medical device companies, seeking out the smaller CROs is probably a best practice.
Yeah.
Laura,
Yeah, I mean,
want to continue?
Sure. My favorite topic. So regulatory and ethics submissions. If you can go to the next slide, Rob, there are a few things that we can do to make sure that we go through this whole regulatory approval process as smoothly as possible, as fast as possible. The first thing I would want to touch base on, and it may sound like, of course, no, but in the real practice, it's not, is that the whole team is actually aligned on the design of the study, on the risk that is involved in the study, on the classification of the device, the marketing status of the device. If you can put that in a memo that can be distributed to everyone, honestly, I recommend it because it happens so often that a wrong submission pathway has been chosen. You can imagine you go into the validation stage. It takes, what, 2 weeks, a month maybe, and then in the end, an authority or an EC tells you that you misclassified and you need to resubmit and do it all over again because the requirements are also different depending on the regulatory pathway that you're choosing. So you just don't want to end up there. And that is why it's important to just spend a little bit more time in the beginning to make sure that the teams are aligned and make sure that all that understanding is, or that everyone is at the same page. The other thing is related to validation, so the validation of the package. So most of the authorities, NECs usually as well, they first do a validation check. So just to see if all of the documents are there, if it's compliant with the regulation that you're working on, whether that's EU MDR, EU IVDR, or the regulation of any specific country. It's just a quick win, I would say, because there is a lot of guidance available. A lot of competent authorities, like for example, the MHRA in the UK, they actually have a checklist that tells you exactly what you need to submit. Of course, in EU MDR and EU IVDR, there is also their annexes that tell you exactly what it is that you need. It has been quite some time, quite some years after MDR and IVDR came out that it was unclear. Maybe sometimes it is still unclear what it actually is that you need to submit, but I feel like authorities have been catching up quite a bit. So do the research, make sure that your packages are valid, so you can move through that phase quite quickly. Another item would be related to versioning. So there you will, of course, or if you have a multi-country study, you will have different submission processes in the different countries. It could be in some countries that you, in the EU, for example, need to submit to a competent authority and an ethics committee at the same time. And then the ethics committee gives you feedback on the protocol, for example, and that is being upversioned to a new version. Then that needs to go into the package of the competent authority at some point as well. So you can already see that these versions, and if that's just one country, that these versions can sometimes lead to quite some mix-up quickly. Could also be that, for example, an update requested by one authority in a country is actually also quite relevant for the other countries, in which way you will also need to make sure that those versions are aligned. So it can get complicated quite quickly. So have a good system in place to make sure that the right versions are submitted everywhere, that the same version in the end is approved in all the countries that it needs to be approved in. So that is maybe a small tip, but it just avoids a lot of headache in study startup, but you can only imagine also further down the line of the study that avoids a lot of problems. The biggest issue, if you can call it that way, is that even though, for example, in the EU, which is my favorite example, there are regulations on EU level like the EU MDR, EU IVDR, there's still so many differences in between the actual countries. So that's why it's important that you partner maybe with a CRO that has that exact specific knowledge as we were already talking about. partnering with small CROs that have the local presence, that know exactly what needs to be done in which country is so important. Because even though it's regulated on EU level, which kind of competent authority submissions need to be done, in every country, it looks totally different because it can be that submissions are parallel tracked, can be that, for example, local approvals are still required, as we already mentioned, but also some countries, for example, want you to first obtain ethics committee approval, then competent authority approval, can do it in parallel, can do it combined. So you just need to be actually sure about what kind of pathway you will need to go down to. And also for your sites, it's really important because the burden on the sites can sometimes be very high. I think, Sean, you were mentioning something in the chat about Germany. Germany is the perfect example as well of how complicated it can sometimes get. You need a lot of, for example, certifications that testify that the investigators actually have experience with medical devices and with the actual regulation, or with IVDs and actual regulation. You can need to obtain, for example, a lot of signature pages, not only from the principal investigator, but also from other investigators, like everyone almost involved in the study. So it can get complicated quite quickly, which again, why it's important to just make sure that you have that expertise. And if you don't have it as a sponsor, that you partner with someone that has that. Yeah, I feel like time is going quickly, so I will not be going into too much detail, just differences in between countries. In the US, for example, it is sometimes easy and quick way of doing studies. Just want to tell you as well that even in the US, there are also quite some differences in between sites. That, for example, some sites can accept central IRB review. Others will need to involve their own local IRB or need to issue a reliance agreement to go to the central IRB. And then there is a whole bunch of local approvals that you can also may need to obtain per site. So on paper, can go fast, like a central IRB review could be like just 1 month, even maybe 2 weeks. But then again, there's still so many other factors to take into account also in the US. So depends on what you're actually looking for.
Just a quick announcement. Next week on that Thursday, we're doing a MLV webinar with Agra team and with Rich Holborough from BSI and another speaker whose name I can't remember at the moment. Clinical data transferability strategies for leveraging cross-regional evidence. Somewhat related to this. Anyway, that's my announcement. Sorry for the marketing interruption.
Quick commercial. That's perfectly fine. Thank you. And then the EU. So most of you are probably familiar with it. If you can, click through. So in the EU, we have, of course, I mentioned it several times, EU MDR, EU IVDR. The competent authority approvals are regulated per those regulations, so you can find exactly what needs to be submitted. All looks quite easy and straightforward. In practice, a little bit different because there's still so many country differences, even for competent authorities. But again, also for ethics committees, because it's not the only thing that is described in the EU MDR, IVDR is that you mostly will need to obtain an ethics committee approval, but how that really looks like is then still quite different. Some countries have central ethics committees, some have locals. So yeah, that is something that you need to take into account. And then the site-specific approvals, as we already mentioned several times. So that means that if you can go to the next slide, Rob, that we still see a lot of, oh, it's not on this slide. Can you just go one forward and I'll just go to that one first and then back? I mean, two slides further. So not this one, but the one after. Yep, thank you. So here, for example, I just, took a sample of a few countries to just let you know what it really looks like, even though the regulation is the same. So for example, Belgium, if you have a pre-market study, but I'm just focusing on that for the purpose of this presentation. If you have a pre-market study, you can actually just submit to the competent authority and you will get one nice consolidated opinion from ethics committee and competent authority, which is great. Also, the competent authority is very approachable for questions. There may be some local approvals that are needed depending on the site, but in general, in Belgium, it's quite straightforward. In France, for example, it's then different, no? It is a parallel review, so you need to submit a separate package to ethics committee, separate package to competent authority. In France, there are also some other bodies that are involved, like, for example, for data protection, you have the CNIL, For contracting, if you're not using the standard contract on national level, the contrat unique, you have CNOM, which is another body that is involved and needs to provide an approval. Germany, then again, favorite country, you need to do a sequential submission. So first ethics committee, then competent authority. Also local ECs are involved there. As I already mentioned briefly, extensive requirements for the investigators. You need a national coordinating investigator. So this whole purpose is not to tell you all the specific countries, but my bottom line is just make sure that you know the specifics of the specific countries, because there is quite some difference. And the Netherlands, for example, they only have a validation, so only the competent authority. So the CCMO will only look at whether all the documents are actually there, but then the actual review is being done by an ethics committee. And per site, you have a very specific suitability process, and you need to obtain board of directors approval, sometimes also technical device review. Yeah, again, quite some differences in between the different countries. If you can go back one slide, Rob. Yeah. Luckily, there is some alignment ongoing in the EU from the European Commission. So I have seen some initiatives. For example, this pilot coordinated competent authority assessment for clinical investigations and performance studies. I recently noticed that the deadline to be entering into this project has been extended. So it's now until the 30th of April. And it's really meant to, as it says, not to coordinate the competent authority approval process. So it could be both for medical device studies as for in vitro diagnostic studies. It's a pilot project, so it doesn't mean that you do not still need to get an approval of each country, but I'm happy to see that there are steps into the right direction, I would say, to actually get to some more alignment. Another example is a combined project, which also has it specifically for combined studies, but they also have this kind of all-in-one procedure pilot project, which is specifically for studies, both with the EU CTR involved and the EU IVDR or MDR. So that call is currently closed at this point, so you can no longer participate in the pilot, but also a very exciting project, and happy to see that at least there is some initiatives for alignment in the EU. That was all on regulatory and ethics committees. I don't know if anyone has any question there.
So the coordinated assessment program, again, I've heard talk about this thing. It's happening, but some countries won't lead. They'll only follow, and it is.
Yeah.
Is it an added layer, or is it helpful? When is it going to be real?
Very valid questions and things that we obviously are all asking ourselves and don't know at this point. I've been on a webinar, actually. Someone was asking with the European Commission, someone was asking the exact same question. They're very political, no? So it is a pilot. There is no actually information about how this will actually be rolled out and when this will be rolled out. Of course, we need to give them some grace. This is not an easy exercise. But yes, at this point, it's something that remains to be seen if it actually within the pilot project helps to reduce your timelines, because as you can see, it would be one, it's for multinational studies, but as you say, Sean, not all countries are participating, or at least not as a reviewing member state. So it could be that you then are going to participate into this project. It takes 2 up till maybe 5 months to actually get that approval, but you still need to submit on a national level as well. Of course, it will be accelerated because you will already have an approval from the coordinated assessment, but that step, you still need to do that. You still also need to obtain ethics committee approval. So we'll see how it goes. I guess it's a step in a good direction, and we'll see what the actual outcome will be.
Daniel brings up one of my favorite questions, which is, where does human factors fit into all this?
Human factors is something that all manufacturers should be considering, both when they're designing their clinical trial and also when they're doing all of their clinical evaluation plan authoring and preparations. So whilst not all clinical trials involve some kind of human factors, it is something that manufacturers should be thinking about. My expertise would be to get some consultation on this. So speak to some experts who have expertise in human factors, because human factors is only becoming a bigger and bigger part of the evidence package required for both submissions to FDA and submissions to notified bodies. So while not always necessary part of the clinical evidence, human factors is now frequently being required in the clinical trial design as well, to make sure that your device is usable. Is it intuitive? Is it simple to use, involving the end user and also families of the user, etc. So yeah, my advice would be to work with a consultancy who have expertise in human factors and perhaps can help you with some volunteer studies, and so you can generate the early human factor evidence that can go alongside your clinical evidence.
Beautiful, thank you.
The reason why I asked the question is because if you have a medical device where the patient interaction with it is going to be higher than what the doctor interaction is going to be, the clinician, there are different aspects of human factors involved. So you have to keep that in mind. And that's why I was just thinking, but obviously, because human factors do have an impact on the outcome of that clinical study.
Exactly. And if you can collect data which demonstrate that human factors has been taken into consideration as part of your clinical study, then that's fantastic. That's more bang for your buck. I'm thinking particularly about wearables products, where you may have an app, you may have a device, and you can have a perfectly run clinical trial where you generate the outcomes that you need to satisfy the regulators, but patients find the device really hard to use and it's clunky and it's not intuitive. If you can capture that data within the confines of your clinical investigation, then brilliant. That's something that you should do. And we're seeing human factors is a bigger and bigger part of the never-ending list of problems device manufacturers have. So yeah, manufacturers should be thinking about human factors from day one.
Perhaps we should do a session soon on human factors. Okay. Nikhil, you have a question, comment.
Yeah, hi. So this is Nikhil. Nice to see you, Rob, again.
Hi.
So this is largely around the ethics, So there is a large shift towards move for real-world evidence data collection in EU and in the UK. What do ethics and authorities think about this? Do the studies need to be designed as robustly as other clinical trials? Are the processes more simpler? What's your take or experience designing these surveys?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't rely on a regulator or a notified body accepting a lower level of clinical investigation with the promise to do real-world evidence unless you'd had that pre-agreed already. So okay, sometimes you can have an interaction with a notified body or indeed FDA, and you can agree to these real-world evidence post-market follow-up. But I would make sure that your clinical trial design is well structured and meets all of the requirements, regardless of your real world evidence. However, to your point, Nikhil, I think the regulators are becoming more accepting of real world evidence studies, and it's more intuitive. A clinical trial is a very prescriptive experiment with clearly defined boundaries and parameters, and it's kind of artificial. It's not how a device is going to be used in the real world. So I think the regulators and the ethics committees are becoming more supportive of showing the benefit and safety and performance of your device with real world evidence studies, because that's actually how it's being used in real life. So I think we're moving towards a real world evidence post-market demonstration of how effective, safe, and performance of your device. But I think it's a shift rather than thinking that, oh, I'll just do real world evidence. I'll have a much smaller scale clinical trial, fewer patients. So yeah, great question.
Thanks.
Sean, we could maybe do a session on real world evidence as well.
Real world evidence, in silico testing, human factors. There are a lot of components that go into this, but what I would like to ask is, where does AI fit into all this? And how can AI facilitate study design protocols? What does the CRO of 2028 look like?
Gosh, we have 3 minutes, Sean. How do I answer that in 3 minutes? Because we do have other points that I think we're perhaps not going to get to now. Um,
Okay,
so
well, we'll put that on hold.
okay, because I could speak for a really long time about AI, and there's lots of very good use cases of AI. There's also examples of not so good use cases of AI. So,
Agreed.
yeah, maybe we could do a session on AI, but I'm somewhere in the middle. I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I think it can help and it can support, but so long as it's a human being who's making a decision at the end of the day, then that's the most important thing. I'm not talking about software as a medical device. I'm talking about the use of AI in
Mhm.
clinical trial design, writing protocols, etc. It can be a useful tool. But I've seen we would never do this at Franklin Health. But I've seen examples of other CROs who've run protocols through ChatGPT and asked for suggested edits to endpoints and objectives and stuff. And so I think one of the biggest considerations is intellectual property, because once you put something through a large language model, it's essentially into the public domain, and that's one of the biggest problems is where you're giving away companies' intellectual property and confidentiality. So yeah, Sean, you've got me started now. I could go on for hours and hours and
Oh,
hours.
okay. Well,
Uh,
I'm gonna stop you, and I'm
yeah,
gonna say let's have an interview about that separately,
okay.
and I will be more than happy to interview you on that subject. The In the last 2 minutes, we had a question from Luke, and the question was, how do we go about assessing a small CRO and whether or not they're, how do you pick, you know? Obviously, it's very easy to go to one of the top three, right?
hmm
So, how do you assess a small CRO? What questions should we be asking you?
Oh, great question. So I would ask for your recent therapeutic area expertise. Have you delivered studies like this? I would ask for the geographies in which you work. Are you experts in EU? Do you have experts in US FDA as well? I would want to know what team are going to be working on the project, how many studies that you have, because with the larger CROs, they're able to operate at scale and they're able to bring in teams very, very quickly. So capacity might not be as important. I find that smaller companies have better experiences with smaller CROs because there's that flexibility there, the accountability, and you can often ensure that the project team that are on the bid defense call are going to be the project team that actually deliver the study.
Mm.
And that is certainly not going to be the case for larger CROs. So I, essentially all the very basic questions such as have you done these studies before? Do you have expertise? I would ask them if they utilize any technology. Essentially, pretty much the simplest questions. You can tell once you
Well,
are
may
speaking
I
to.
interfere? It was my
Sure.
question.
Okay.
Because if you're a startup, you don't do know nothing about contract
Mm.
research. So
hmm
if I ask you a question, have you done this before? You say yes.
hmm
How am I ever to evaluate that answer? You have to show some evidence. You show them this is a company like yours, and we did the research this way.
Exactly, yeah. So we will be able to show you case studies of similar projects that we'd led. What was the problem? What was the sponsor that we worked with?
Mm.
What did we do? And then what was the outcome? So we can show you examples of devices that we've brought to market, protocols that we've written, and examples of case studies as well. So yeah, you should always ask a CRO to demonstrate their expertise, and that would be part of the bid defense process.
Mhm.
So and the small CRO, small manufacturer relationship is very different because often as a small manufacturer, you don't really know anything about clinical research. You don't know about all of the things that we've talked through today. So you really need someone who can lead you through the whole process. So you do have to have possibly a larger element of trust there. With larger CROs, they have entire departments dedicated to study startup regulatory. So you do need the more kind of hand-holding really, and that's the part that excites me the most, is getting to work with the most innovative segment of the market, the people that are new. They may be engineers, scientists. They're looking for guidance to how to bring their device to market, and that's what I really love. So yeah, good question. Put me on the spot. Thank you.
So on that note, we have to wrap up. But what I
Sure.
would like to say is reach out to Laura and Rob, connect with them on LinkedIn. And Luke, to your question, I would say it's like selecting an engineer, it's like selecting a manufacturer, it's like selecting a marketing agency. And really, you have to trust your instincts and you have to form a connection with them, and you have to understand if you're just being handed a template for an answer, or you're being given advice that's individualized to you. And I think that you can smell the difference. And that would be my advice on working with any expert in our field. Do we have any final questions before we sign off? And so you know, I assume you're open to partnerships. We're looking to expand our partnership platform in 2026, and to create opportunities for people looking for CROs, people looking for human factors, people looking for engineers, people looking for regulatory consultants, and try to find a way that every single company doesn't have to create a partnership program, but can participate in the MLVX partnership program and automatically be connected with 50 or 100 different potential or more. So yeah, anyway, that's it from me for this week. And
Well, then I would just like to thank you all very much. Most of all, you, Sean, for giving us this opportunity to speak with you all, to meet you all. It would be great to connect via LinkedIn. We have some more stumbling blocks that we would love to talk to you about if you're interested. And yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. I'll see you next week. Thank you.